Part 1, The Hook and Thesis. The consensus question. The Empire Strikes Back is frequently summarized as the definitive maturation of a space opera, a story that trades the simplistic moral binary of its predecessor for a more complex, somber middle chapter. This consensus frames the film as a necessary darkening of tone, an evolution from victory to strategic retreat that deepens the stakes of a galactic conflict. Yet, this reading obscures the film's true function. It is a rigorous exploration of the irreconcilability between personal legacy and moral agency. The film does not merely present a grittier atmosphere, it constructs a psychological trap where the protagonist's entire understanding of reality is revealed to be a prison built from his own ancestral history. The power of the film lies in how it systematically strips away the romanticism of the hero's journey to reveal that, in the face of inevitable, systemic dominance, the only true act of selfhood is the refusal to adopt the shadow of one's predecessor. The world-building of the film reinforces this sense of entrapment through its architecture and spatial navigation. The rebellion, defined by the rusted, utilitarian aesthetics of Hoth, occupies a landscape of scarcity where survival requires total subordination to the group's survival. In contrast, the Empire operates through a geometry of cold, clinical order. Spaces like the interior of the Super Star Destroyer or the sleek, gaslit corridors of Cloud City represent an architecture of absolute control, where the individual is dwarfed by the sheer scale of the apparatus. This hierarchy serves as a physical manifestation of the antagonist's logic. The Empire views the galaxy not as a collection of entities, but as a system to be optimized. The film highlights this through the contrast between the organic, messy struggle of the protagonists and the frictionless, synthetic dominance of the Imperial machine. At the heart of this conflict is Luke Skywalker's epistemic fracture. For the first two acts, Luke operates under the assumption of a heroic metanarrative inherited from his mentors, the idea that he is the rightful heir to a legacy of light. His training on Dagobah with Yoda is not a traditional apprenticeship in power, but an arduous process of deprogramming. Yoda forces Luke to confront the limits of his own ego, demonstrating that his reliance on physical combat and linear, goal-oriented action is a symptom of his internal lack of clarity. When Luke rushes to Bespin to confront Vader, he is driven by a romanticized vision of himself as a savior. The film dismantles this vision with surgical precision. The revelation that Vader is his father is not merely a plot twist, it is the total collapse of Luke's fabricated self. He realizes that his identity is inextricably linked to the very force he seeks to destroy. This trauma is deeply somatic. Luke's journey from the cave on Dagobah, where he decapitates a vision of Vader only to see his own face beneath the mask, to the literal dismemberment he suffers on the gantry of Cloud City, charts the disintegration of his physical and psychic autonomy. He treats his body as a weapon, yet discovers that his body is actually a hereditary tether. His pain is the physical evidence of his entrapment within the binary of the Force. The antagonist, Darth Vader, represents the ultimate realization of this state. He is a man who has entirely surrendered his humanity to become a living component of the state's technological architecture. Vader's cold, unwavering logic, his attempt to recruit Luke to rule alongside him, is the logical conclusion of the path Luke is tempted to follow. The film's technical execution mirrors this psychological descent. The cinematography shifts from the high-key, survivalist grit of the Hoth sequences to the deep shadows and oppressive, saturated reds of the Bespin encounter. The use of negative space in the final duel is masterful. Luke is often framed in tight, claustrophobic close-ups that emphasize his isolation, while Vader is captured in long, dominant shots that place him firmly within the vast, industrial geometry of the carbon freezing chamber. The sound design further amplifies this, utilizing a mix of mechanical, synthesized drones and the sudden, jarring silence of the void during pivotal revelations. Ultimately, The Empire Strikes Back refuses the catharsis of a clean resolution. It concludes not with a triumph of ideology, but with a necessary act of existential defiance. By rejecting Vader's offer of a shared, ordered future, Luke accepts a state of radical uncertainty and pain. He chooses the fall into the unknown over the security of a predetermined, corrupt legacy. The film remains a profound meditation on the burden of choice, positing that one's heritage is not a blueprint for the future, but a shadow that must be actively navigated. It leaves the protagonist, and the viewer, in a space of lingering, unresolved conflict, asserting that the value of the struggle is not found in the certainty of the outcome, but in the persistence of the individual will against the weight of history. The subversion question. The Empire Strikes Back is frequently lauded as a grand, mythic adventure, the quintessential hero's journey where a young protagonist matures through trial and tribulation. This consensus reading, however, treats the film as a romanticized epic of destiny and moral triumph. In reality, the film functions as a chilling deconstruction of inherited ideology and the violent, systematic dismantling of the individual's identity. The film is a study in the psychological erosion of a subject forced to reconcile a reality that fundamentally contradicts their foundational beliefs. It demonstrates that the path to adulthood is not a triumphant ascent but a brutal process of systemic trauma, where the truth acts as an instrument of destruction rather than liberation. The world of The Empire Strikes Back is one governed by the cold mechanics of scarcity and the predatory reach of a sprawling, bureaucratic hegemony. The Empire is not merely a political entity but a manifestation of totalizing order that treats human life as disposable capital, while the rebellion survives in the margins through obsolescence and desperate, improvised technology. This disparity is captured through the architecture of the film. The sterile, white-tiled corridors of the Empire represent a frictionless, dehumanizing power, while the chaotic, ice-bound caverns of Hoth and the rusted, industrial sprawl of Cloud City emphasize the precarious nature of existence outside that central control. The film visualizes the insignificance of the individual against these massive systems, positioning characters as pawns in a conflict that demands their complete subordination to a cause or a destiny that they did not choose. Luke Skywalker's progression through this environment is defined by an epistemic fracture. He enters the narrative clutching a fabricated ego, the son of a fallen hero, a budding warrior, only to have this internal metanarrative systematically stripped away. The trauma is visceral and somatic. His loss of a hand in the final act is the physical manifestation of his loss of self. When Vader reveals the truth of his lineage, he is not merely revealing a parentage, he is destroying the binary framework of good versus evil that allowed Luke to justify his actions. The film forces Luke to confront the fact that his moral identity is parasitic, constructed entirely upon the propaganda of those who stood to benefit from his service. The dialogue during the climactic duel reflects this collapse, as Luke's desperate, reflexive moralizing is met with the pragmatic, cold logic of a system that has already subsumed his father. The philosophical underpinnings of the film lean heavily into a form of existential dread. The Force is not a benevolent mysticism but an absolute, indifferent natural law that demands compliance and surrender. The film rejects the idea of a soft, comforting providence. Instead, it presents an universe where agency is an illusion. The characters are caught in a cycle of repetition compulsion, constantly drawn toward the sites of their own psychological destruction. When Luke faces Vader in the carbon-freezing chamber, he is confronting his own inevitable trajectory, the transformation of a human being into a processed, static commodity. The film argues that the hero is simply a vessel for historical forces, and that the only true revolt is the refusal to accept the labels and histories imposed by those in power. Technically, the film reinforces this sense of entrapment through its spatial language. The cinematography frequently utilizes wide, isolating shots that dwarf the characters against the immense, cold scale of space or monolithic structures. The sound design serves as a constant reminder of the mechanical weight of the world, with the heavy, rhythmic respiration of the antagonist acting as the diegetic heartbeat of an indifferent, industrial reality. The effects are never used to distract, but to anchor the narrative in a tactile, decaying universe where every piece of hardware, from the Millennium Falcon to the lightsaber, feels weathered by centuries of conflict. This integration of the synthetic with the organic creates a palpable sense of fatigue, a society exhausted by its own adherence to grand, violent narratives. Ultimately, The Empire Strikes Back leaves the viewer in a state of suspended agony, rejecting the comfort of a moral victory. The film concludes not with the restoration of order, but with the characters scattered, wounded, and forced to grapple with a new, terrifying reality where their old truths have been incinerated. The struggle is shown to be not a means to an end, but a recursive loop of violence and trauma. By refusing to offer the catharsis of a clean resolution, the film demands that the audience abandon the comfort of the heroic myth, leaving them to sit with the discomfort of an individual who has survived the destruction of their world and is left with the burden of rebuilding from the silence of the void. The anomaly question. The Empire Strikes Back is frequently lauded as the definitive triumph of franchise storytelling, a masterwork of expansion that elevates the simple archetypes of its predecessor into a complex, operatic tragedy. While the consensus centers on the film as a masterful escalation of stakes, this view obscures the film's more disruptive project. It is a clinical dismantling of the hero's journey, a narrative that purposefully subjects its protagonist to systematic ego dissolution. The anomaly that anchors this process, the cave sequence on Dagobah, is often dismissed as a mere exercise in ominous foreshadowing. In reality, it is the film's epistemological fulcrum. By forcing Luke Skywalker to confront his own face beneath the mask of his enemy, the film rejects the comfort of dualistic morality and asserts that the internal shadow is the primary site of historical and personal conflict. The world of The Empire Strikes Back is defined by a suffocating, industrial rigidity. Architecture serves as a direct extension of imperial ideology. The sterile, cavernous corridors of the Star Destroyer and the carbon-freezing chamber on Bespin emphasize a universe where human spontaneity is suppressed by geometric order. This visual hierarchy informs the film's pervasive sense of scarcity. Unlike the vibrant, lived-in aesthetic of the Outer Rim, the locales here are hostile, defined by elemental extremes, the freezing desolation of Hoth, the claustrophobic swamps of Dagobah, and the synthetic, corporate elegance of Cloud City. These environments function as crucibles, stripping the characters of their protective illusions and exposing the limits of their agency against a sprawling, indifferent bureaucracy. At the heart of the film's psychological inquiry is the epistemic fracture experienced by Luke Skywalker. His growth is not defined by the accumulation of power or skill, but by the violent shedding of a manufactured ego. Initially, Luke operates under the inherited metanarrative of the virtuous rebel, a self-conception bolstered by his mentors. The cave on Dagobah serves as the physical manifestation of his subconscious, where the boundary between hero and monster dissolves. This encounter is not merely symbolic, it is a profound somatic experience that leaves him vulnerable. His failure to integrate this knowledge culminates in the final confrontation on Bespin, where the revelation of his lineage forces a total collapse of his moral framework. He is forced to confront the reality that his identity is inextricably linked to the very force he seeks to dismantle. This philosophical rigor is mirrored in the film's technical execution. The cinematography utilizes depth and negative space to emphasize isolation, most notably during the final act. As the camera captures Luke clinging to the weather vane beneath Cloud City, the visual composition shrinks him into insignificance, stripping away the performative grandeur of the conflict. The integration of practical models with matte paintings and innovative lighting creates a tactile, heavy reality that prevents the film from feeling like a sterile fantasy. The sound design, particularly the oppressive mechanical respiration of Darth Vader, serves as a diegetic trigger for the protagonist's trauma, transforming the antagonist into a constant, haunting presence that exists in the character's psyche rather than just the physical space. Ultimately, The Empire Strikes Back functions as a deliberate exercise in the ethics of uncertainty. By denying the audience and the protagonist a traditional resolution, the film asserts that truth is not a static reward for moral rectitude, but a volatile state to be navigated. The ending does not provide catharsis, instead, it leaves the characters in a state of suspended animation, their illusions shattered and their futures fundamentally rewritten. The film's enduring power lies in this refusal to tidy the narrative. It demands that the hero, and the viewer, accept that the struggle for meaning is not found in the defeat of an external enemy, but in the harrowing work of confronting the darkness within the self. The film concludes not with the return to a stable status quo, but with the painful, necessary opening of a new, unscripted reality. The synthesis question. The Empire Strikes Back functions as a profound meditation on the necessity of failure as a prerequisite for authentic sovereignty. While often viewed through the lens of a heroic journey, the film actually presents an argument that true agency can only be seized once the comforting myths of lineage and destiny are shattered. The film's defining anomaly, Luke Skywalker's harrowing descent into the literal and psychological abyss of the Cloud City shaft, serves as the physical manifestation of this thesis. By severing the protagonist from his hand, his weapon, and his inherited belief system, the narrative forces a reconciliation between the individual and the crushing weight of their own shadow. Sociologically, the galaxy of The Empire Strikes Back is defined by the inescapable reach of institutional entropy. The Empire operates as a totalizing force, transforming the vast, untamed frontiers into sterile, predictable zones of extraction. Whether on the frozen plains of Hoth or the industrial depths of Bespin, the environment consistently enforces a reality where independence is a temporary luxury, quickly reclaimed by the machinery of the state. This is not a world of heroic individualists, it is a world where even the most capable survivors, like Han Solo, find themselves ultimately commodified and frozen as decorative assets. The architecture reflects this, shifting from the claustrophobic, organic resistance of the rebel base to the frictionless, corporate indifference of Cloud City. These spaces are designed to strip characters of their autonomy, framing their struggles against the backdrop of an inexorable system that views human experience as raw data to be calculated, captured, or discarded. Psychologically, the film tracks the collapse of the protagonist's fabricated ego. Luke begins the journey draped in the mantle of the Chosen One, a role curated by his mentors to serve a specific, utilitarian purpose. This identity is a fragile construct, maintained by a lack of critical information and a reliance on external moral authority. The epistemic fracture occurs the moment the mask falls away, revealing that the antagonist he seeks to defeat is not a distant, abstract evil but the very source of his own biological and power-based identity. This trauma is etched into his physicality. He does not merely lose a fight, he loses a part of himself, forced to exist in a state of incompleteness. This somatic memory of the amputation serves as the anchor for his growth, transforming the pain of disillusionment into the foundation of a new, self-authored morality that exists outside the binary of the Jedi-Sith dialectic. Philosophically, the film rejects the comfort of predetermined narratives. The masters who guide Luke, Yoda, and Obi-Wan demand a deontological adherence to a code that prioritizes the abstract, greater good over the messy, human reality of the individual. They offer a version of the world where truth is handed down through tradition and sacrifice is a currency to be spent on their behalf. Luke's decision to abandon his training to save his friends is an act of existential rebellion against this deterministic view. He opts for the absurdity of the present moment, the irrational, human choice to intervene, over the sterile, calculated future predicted by his elders. In doing so, he aligns his internal value system with his external actions, proving that one must risk the entire project of good to maintain the integrity of the self. The visual craft of the film reinforces this trajectory through a meticulous use of isolation and perspective. Throughout the second act, the camera frequently captures Luke in wide, crushing shots that emphasize the scale of the environment against his solitary figure, signaling his helplessness. The transition to the final confrontation in the carbon freezing chamber utilizes sharp, high-contrast chiaroscuro lighting that externalizes the internal schism of the character. As he stands on the gantry, dwarfed by the massive exhaust vents and the looming silhouette of his father, the frame explicitly positions him as a casualty of history. The transition from the chaotic, handheld energy of the Hoth evacuation to the static, weighted compositions of Cloud City mirrors his descent from a hopeful participant in a war to a realization of his own powerlessness. Ultimately, The Empire Strikes Back concludes not with a resolution of the conflict, but with an acceptance of the struggle. The final image of the fleet, a collection of solitary vessels silhouetted against the vast, indifferent aperture of the galaxy, underscores the film's legacy, the dismantling of the hero myth. The narrative demands that its characters, and its audience, confront the reality that there is no clean victory, only the persistent, difficult work of defining one's own existence in the wake of systemic failure. By forcing the hero to suffer the destruction of his own worldview, the film creates a space for true maturity, asserting that the only way to escape the cycle of the past is to lose everything one thinks they know. Part 2. Context and World Building. Systems, Scarcity, and Capital. The Empire Strikes Back functions as a brutal examination of a universe governed by entropic collapse and the rigid centralization of power. The film establishes a galaxy defined by extreme technological scarcity, where the remnants of a failed democratic era are scavenged and repurposed to survive the relentless, standardized reach of the Galactic Empire. In this reality, the fundamental currency is not gold or credits, but operational capability, the raw ability to keep hardware functioning in a cosmos that has largely ceased to manufacture for the common good. The imperial hegemony is visualized through a monopoly on pristine, high-tier technology. Their starships and weaponry exhibit a terrifying uniformity, characterized by sterile, monochromatic surfaces and an absolute lack of individual ornamentation. This architectural hierarchy reinforces the power structure. The Empire resides in vast, cold, and calculatedly efficient environments like the Executor, where every corridor and command bridge is designed to minimize human friction and maximize total surveillance. By contrast, the Rebel Alliance exists in a state of perpetual maintenance, inhabiting the frozen, claustrophobic caverns of Hoth where they are forced to operate on the literal edge of technological obsolescence. Their gear is weathered, jury-rigged, and physically dangerous, a testament to a society existing in the shadow of a monolithic, exclusionary state. The film reveals that a normal Tuesday for the average civilian involves navigating a landscape of decay and constant resource extraction. The presence of the black market, epitomized by the floating, opportunistic city of Cloud City, illustrates what this society lacks: autonomy and neutral ground. Bespin represents a delicate, artificial bubble of commerce existing solely to exploit the gas giant's resources for a machine-dominated economy. This is a society where human and droid labor is treated as a highly commodified asset. Droids are disposable, interchangeable modules of intellect, and humans like Han Solo are reduced to literal capital, bounties to be traded for the stabilization of larger geopolitical debts. This economic reality dictates the film's philosophical arc. The characters are trapped within an epistemic fracture where their reliance on technology mirrors their internal psychological state. Luke Skywalker, while training with Yoda, experiences the shedding of his previous self, the naive adventurer, and finds that he is ill-equipped for the truth of his lineage. The Force serves as the only resource that cannot be commodified by the Empire, yet it demands a radical rejection of the material world. As Luke grapples with the loss of his hand, the very instrument of his agency, the film forces a reckoning between his physical body and his burgeoning identity. He discovers that his identity is not something he owns, but something that has been constructed by the very power structure he seeks to dismantle. The visual language of the film utilizes intense chiaroscuro to emphasize these themes. The interiors of the Cloud City carbon freezing chamber serve as the nexus of the film's moral and physical tension, where the sleek, cold geometry of the Imperial trap meets the organic, desperate struggle of the protagonist. The use of shadow throughout the film consistently externalizes the Jungian shadow. Vader is not merely an antagonist, but a dark reflection of the potential for absolute, singular purpose that exists within Luke himself. The film's craft, specifically the precise, tactile weight of the practical models and the starkness of its lighting, sells the reality of a universe where the individual is perpetually dwarfed by the massive, shifting gears of the state. The Empire Strikes Back concludes not with a triumph, but with the stripping away of the protagonist's illusions. The destruction of Luke's fabricated sense of self, the heroic narrative he had constructed, leaves him in a state of profound vulnerability. He is cast out into the void, physically and spiritually diminished, having learned that the system he fights is not external to his own bloodline, but intertwined with his very existence. By denying the audience a clean resolution, the film asserts that true agency is found only in the wreckage of one's previous understanding of the world. It is a work that values the uncomfortable, essential truth over the comfort of the status quo, documenting the precise moment when a character realizes that they are no longer a cog in the machine, but a target of the entire system. Architecture and the visual geography. The Empire Strikes Back functions as an expansive exploration of how architectural environments and visual geography serve as physical manifestations of psychological states and power dynamics. The film establishes a distinct hierarchy where the ruling empire asserts dominance through cold, sterile, and hyper-ordered geometry, while the remnants of the rebellion are forced into the fragmented, organic, and decaying margins of the galaxy. This visual stratification reinforces the thesis that power is not merely a political designation but a spatial one, where the empire occupies the frictionless, monolithic heights and the individual is left to navigate the hazardous, cluttered depths of a world in entropy. The empire is characterized by an architectural language of absolute, totalitarian control. Locations like the Star Destroyer bridges, the snowy fortifications of Hoth, and the inner sanctums of Cloud City are defined by clean lines, muted metallic palettes, and a profound lack of soft, organic textures. The production design utilizes scale as a primary tool of intimidation. The massive, oppressive interiors of the Imperial fleet minimize the human subject, rendering individual soldiers and commanders as mere cogs within a vast, pre-programmed machine. This is a society at its peak of technological rigidity, where human movement is restricted to rigid pathways, and every surface, from the polished floors to the uniform walls, is a testament to the erasure of individual identity in favor of systemic uniformity. In contrast, the rebellion is defined by an aesthetic of obsolescence and forced ingenuity. Their bases are not newly minted structures of power but repurposed, scavenged environments. The frozen caverns of Hoth are chaotic, tactile, and claustrophobic. Here, the infrastructure is in a state of visible decay, utilizing the rusted, patched-together hardware of a bygone era. The navigation of these spaces requires intimate, grounded movement, contrasting sharply with the cold, sweeping glides of the Imperial camera work. Where the Empire moves with the smooth, calculated precision of an objective god, the camera tracking the rebels feels more like an anxious participant, capturing the desperation of beings who lack the resources to maintain their own permanence. The film effectively uses this visual contrast to highlight the friction between the organic self and the synthetic state. Cloud City serves as the ultimate site for this conflict. On the surface, it presents itself as a utopia, a sleek, shimmering metropolis that appears to float above the churning, uncontainable storms of Bespin. It is a place of corporate hospitality and artificial light, masquerading as a sanctuary. However, the film reveals that this order is entirely dependent on the exploitation of the natural world beneath it. The architecture is a veneer. Once the characters descend from the polished white corridors into the dark, labyrinthine exhaust vents, the true nature of the system is exposed. The transition from the sanitized public face of the city to the grimy, mechanical underbelly mirrors the internal fracture of the characters who are forced to navigate these treacherous paths when their illusions of safety are stripped away. The geography of the film reinforces the theme of isolation within this system. Whether it is the vast, monochromatic desolation of Hoth or the deep, shadow-filled chasms of the carbon-freezing chamber, the cinematography prioritizes negative space to communicate the crushing weight of the environment. The characters are frequently dwarfed by the architecture around them, emphasizing their insignificance in a struggle that spans far beyond their individual understanding. As Luke Skywalker is forced into the bowels of the city, the visual scale shifts from panoramic control to claustrophobic entrapment, grounding his philosophical and psychological trial within a physical landscape that denies him any easy exit. The technical execution of these spaces creates a cohesive reality where the environment dictates the character's potential for agency. The Empire's reliance on hyperstructured geometry limits the movement and, by extension, the freedom of its inhabitants, while the decaying, sprawling geography of the rebel territories demands a constant, exhausting adaptation. By presenting the Empire as a manifestation of cold, high-tier technological imposition and the rebellion as a struggle for survival within the rusted, organic remnants of the past, the film crafts a world where the architecture is not merely a setting, but an active participant in the character's ongoing battle for self-definition. The visual landscape of The Empire Strikes Back is a map of the internal, proving that the struggle against a totalizing system is always a struggle against the very structures designed to contain the human spirit. Epistemology, information, and society. The Empire Strikes Back functions as a profound meditation on the fragility of truth and the dangerous seduction of inherited narratives. While the film is often viewed through the lens of a heroic space opera, its true weight lies in the deliberate, systematic deconstruction of the protagonist's worldview. Luke Skywalker enters the story believing in a reality defined by binary moral clarity, the light of the Jedi versus the darkness of the Sith. This epistemic foundation, carefully curated by his mentors, acts as a psychological safety net, providing a manageable framework for understanding his place in a chaotic galaxy. However, the film systematically strips away these layers of mediation, revealing that the universe is far less concerned with absolute moral truths than it is with the brutal application of power and the subjective interpretation of history. The world of The Empire Strikes Back is built upon a foundation of information control and propaganda. The Galactic Empire maintains its order not merely through the kinetic force of its fleet, but through the imposition of a singular, state-sanctioned history. This metanarrative positions the Empire as the architect of civilization and peace, erasing the memory of the Republic and painting dissent as irrational chaos. Citizens within the core worlds live in an environment where information is tightly curated. The Empire possesses a monopoly on the dissemination of reality, ensuring that the vast majority of the population remains starved of context regarding the true cost of their security. This is an epistemology of silence and top-down decree, where to question the official story is to invite immediate deletion from the system. In contrast, the outgroups and exiles, those operating on the fringes of the galaxy, such as the inhabitants of Hoth or the denizens of Bespin, exist in a state of epistemological uncertainty. For characters like Han Solo and Lando Calrissian, truth is localized and transactional rather than universal. They navigate a reality defined by scarcity, where data is a commodity to be traded and survival depends on the ability to decipher hidden truths beneath the surface of corporate or imperial presentation. Bespin serves as the ultimate visual metaphor for this tension. It is a city of gilded, high-tech artifice suspended in the clouds, representing the seductive nature of a system that masks its exploitative reality with aesthetic refinement and administrative comfort. Here, the characters are forced to confront the reality that their knowledge is not objective, but contingent upon the shifting loyalties of their environment. Luke's journey is the ultimate case study in the shattering of a fabricated ego. He begins the film operating under a pedagogical structure provided by Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda, both of whom act as the gatekeepers of his reality. They provide the vocabulary, that Force, Jedi, and Father, that defines his identity. Yet, the film reveals that these mentors are themselves practitioners of a necessary deception. By withholding the full truth of his lineage, they attempt to program Luke's path toward a specific, predetermined outcome. The epistemic fracture occurs at the climax in Cloud City, where the revelation of his father's true identity causes the previous, neatly organized structure of his world to dissolve. He is forced to realize that the fundamental reality he was taught to defend was, in part, constructed to manipulate his trajectory. This moment is not a mere plot twist, it is the total collapse of his objective understanding of himself and his history. The film visually reinforces this preoccupation with knowledge and discovery through its deliberate use of shadows and light. Characters are frequently placed in environments where the physical architecture obscures as much as it reveals. In the dark, claustrophobic caves of Dagobah, Luke is confronted with a manifestation of his own psyche, a psychological truth he cannot yet articulate, which forces him to see that his enemy is not only the external oppressor but an extension of his own internal nature. The visual language of the film emphasizes this ambiguity. Characters are rarely shown in full, clear light, often shrouded in the grays, blues, and deep, encroaching blacks of space. This reinforces the idea that in a galaxy of conflicting narratives, the only thing a character can truly possess is their own capacity to choose a path in the absence of absolute certainty. Ultimately, The Empire Strikes Back argues that the path to true agency begins with the rejection of inherited myths. The system relies on the characters remaining within the lines of its provided information, but the film's trajectory moves toward a hard, uncomfortable individualism. Luke is stripped of his hand, his mentor's reliability, and his sense of moral certainty, leaving him to reconstruct his identity from the ruins of his former beliefs. The film concludes not with the return of a clean, heroic status quo, but with the characters suspended in a state of unresolved, open-ended potential. By dismantling the epistemic foundations of its world, the film posits that true wisdom resides in the ability to operate effectively within the gaps of information, choosing one's own truth even when the official record, and the very architects of reality, have failed. Friction, law, and the catalyst. The Empire Strikes Back serves as a profound meditation on the failure of inheritance and the harrowing cost of reclaiming autonomy within a totalizing, bureaucratic apparatus. While frequently analyzed as a simplistic struggle between light and shadow, the film functions as a rigorous examination of how an individual's identity is constructed through, and subsequently fractured by, the crushing weight of legacy. The film posits that true self-actualization is not a process of following a preordained destiny, but a violent, traumatic break from the institutions and ancestral narratives that demand absolute conformity. The world of the film is defined by a monolithic, state-sponsored hierarchy where the individual is treated as a tactical variable. Within the Empire's architecture, characterized by cold, sterile geometries and an industrial obsession with scale, the human element is effectively commodified. The vast, sweeping hangar bays and the suffocating, dark corridors of the Star Destroyers mirror a reality where power is synonymous with the ability to impose order upon chaos. This is a society where justice has been replaced by calculated retribution. The system does not seek to rehabilitate, but to extract total compliance. The Empire's expansion is not merely territorial but epistemic, seeking to unify all disparate systems under a single, ironclad narrative of order. At the center of this mechanism is Luke Skywalker, whose journey represents the collision between his internal, idealized conception of self and the external reality forced upon him. Luke arrives at his pivotal moment of rupture not through a triumph of traditional heroism, but through the collapse of the meta-narrative he relied upon to define his existence. The revelation of his lineage acts as an epistemic fracture, destroying the binary moral framework he inherited from his mentors. By forcing Luke to reckon with his own genetic proximity to the architect of his oppression, the film exposes the cruelty of a destiny written by others. His trauma is not merely an external event, it is a somatic reality, manifesting in the loss of his own hand, a literal amputation of his previous identity. This loss serves as a direct mirror to the film's philosophical underpinnings regarding agency. While the Force provides a metaphysical structure to the universe, the film emphasizes the burden of choice over the comforts of predestination. Characters like Han Solo and Lando Calrissian navigate a world of shifting allegiances where the lines between state authority and corporate pragmatism are perpetually blurred. Their survival depends on their ability to move through the gaps left by the system, operating within the black markets and peripheral spaces that the Empire cannot fully regulate. The tension between the characters' desire for personal freedom and their entanglement in a larger, systemic conflict creates a pervasive atmosphere of existential risk. The visual language of the film reinforces this sense of isolation. The use of vast negative space, whether in the frozen, desolate wastes of Hoth or the alien, cloud-shrouded verticality of Bespin, traps the characters within environments that dwarf their individual concerns. The technical craftsmanship, particularly the blending of complex physical miniatures with groundbreaking matte painting and optical compositing, creates a tactile sense of a world that is heavy, decaying, and relentlessly indifferent. This is not a sleek utopia, it is a universe of rusted hardware and flickering control panels, highlighting a society that maintains its control through the sheer, brute inertia of its own existence. Ultimately, The Empire Strikes Back rejects the notion of a neat resolution. The film concludes not with the restoration of order, but with a state of unresolved instability. The protagonists are left physically and psychologically scarred, adrift in a cosmos that has proven both their myths and their expectations to be insufficient. The triumph of the film lies in this refusal to offer catharsis. Instead, it presents the struggle for self-definition as an ongoing, painful necessity. The final imagery of the heroes looking out toward a distant, uncertain horizon captures the essence of the human condition in an oppressive system, to possess no map for the future, but to accept the burden of constructing one's own meaning in spite of the inevitable collapse of the old order. The film stands as a testament to the idea that the path toward true liberation requires the courage to discard the legacy of the past, even when that past is woven into the very fabric of one's own biology and history. Part 3: The Human Element. Epistemology and the meta-narrative of the self. The Empire Strikes Back operates as a profound meditation on the collapse of the self-constructed hero, moving beyond a simple journey of martial progression to examine the violent fragmentation of identity. At its core, the film functions as an epistemic crisis for Luke Skywalker, who enters the narrative tethered to a fabricated ego rooted in the romanticized, hagiographic myth of his father. He views himself through the lens of a destined avenger, a moral archetype inherited from the binary oppositions of rebellion and empire. This metanarrative provides Luke with a sense of purposeful continuity, allowing him to justify his hazardous impulsivity as the necessary behavior of a destined savior. However, the film systematically dismantles this ego, forcing Luke to confront a reality that cannot be reconciled with his established worldview. The epistemic fracture occurs during the climactic confrontation in Cloud City. As Darth Vader reveals his paternity, the collapse of Luke's truth is total. The object of his righteous hatred is revealed to be the source of his own biological and spiritual inheritance. The horror Luke experiences is not merely the result of physical maiming, but the immediate evaporation of his identity as an independent agent of good. In this moment, the vocabulary of the rebellion, a lexicon of clear-cut moral distinctions and heroic teleology, fails him completely. Luke is forced to exist in a space where the binary structures of his society are exposed as insufficient masks for a much more chaotic and interconnected reality. His scream, hanging in the void of the gantry shaft, serves as the somatic recognition of this intellectual death. He possesses no language for a father who is both a monster and his own ancestor, and this communicative failure mirrors his retreat into a state of primal, non-verbal trauma. This psychological disintegration is mirrored in the film's wider preoccupation with the limits of discourse. Throughout the training on Dagobah, Yoda purposefully denies Luke the comfort of linear, didactic instruction, instead forcing him to engage with the amorphous nature of the Force through sensory experience and paradox. Yoda understands that Luke's reliance on language and concrete goals acts as a cognitive barrier. Luke's failure in the cave, where he decapitates the specter of his own father, demonstrates his inability to integrate his shadow. He projects his internal aggression onto the image of Vader because he lacks the self-awareness to recognize that the violence he fears is already a constituent part of his own psyche. The cave functions as a psychic mirror, revealing that his moral certainty is a thin veil over a nascent, unrefined capacity for destruction. The film further emphasizes this internal fracturing through the parallel journey of Han Solo and Leia Organa. While Luke struggles with the meta-narrative of his ancestry, Han is trapped in a defensive cycle of avoidant behavior, tethering his identity to the functional utility of the Millennium Falcon and his status as a pragmatic survivor. His resistance to acknowledging his position within the rebellion represents a refusal to abandon his fabricated ego as a man apart from the system. Yet, as the narrative progresses, the shifting spatial geography of the film, from the frozen desolation of Hoth to the sterile, trap-like architecture of Cloud City, forces these characters into intimate configurations that strip away their public masks. In the claustrophobic corridors of the facility, the performative armor of the rebel commander and the cynical scoundrel dissolves, leaving only the raw, somatic reality of their shared vulnerability. Ultimately, the film posits that true agency is only possible once the initial, inherited ego is destroyed. Luke's leap into the abyss represents his final rejection of the false binary imposed upon him by the Emperor and his own hubris. By choosing to let go, he acknowledges the limitations of his previous understanding and accepts the burden of a truth that is no longer mediated by the grand narratives of his mentors. He emerges at the film's conclusion as a figure defined not by his certainty, but by his endurance in the face of radical uncertainty. The final image of the fleet gazing out into the expanse does not promise a return to a pre-existing order, but instead marks the beginning of an existential state where the characters must forge a new, subjective morality from the wreckage of their previous lives. The tragedy of the film is the necessary foundation for the protagonist's reconstruction. The hero does not succeed by maintaining his identity, but by allowing it to break entirely, thereby creating the space for a more authentic, integrated self to arise from the silence of the void. Trauma and somatic experiencing. The Empire Strikes Back functions as a profound examination of the somatic reality of trauma, positioning the human body not as a static vessel, but as a dynamic repository for unresolved psychic conflict. While the narrative ostensibly follows the grand arc of a galactic rebellion, the film's psychological weight rests on the inescapable link between internal wounds and physical manifestation. Luke Skywalker begins the journey as an aspirant defined by his idealized, ancestral aspirations, yet his progression through the film serves as a systematic stripping away of his ego. The foundational trauma of his existence, the hidden, fractured nature of his own lineage, remains buried beneath layers of duty and training until the third act, where the revelation of his father's identity serves as the ultimate, violent eruption of repressed truth. This trauma is not merely conceptual, it is deeply somatic. Luke carries the memory of his past and the weight of his expectations in his physical performance, particularly through the exhaustion of his training on Dagobah. His somatic memory manifests in the way he struggles to integrate the teachings of Yoda with the frantic, reactive energy he brings from the wider galaxy. When he enters the cave to confront the manifestation of his fear, the trauma is literalized. He strikes out at the shadow of Darth Vader, only to discover his own face beneath the mask. This scene functions as a visceral bridge between his external conflict and his internal fragmentation. The injury he sustains, the cauterized stump of his hand, acts as a permanent, indelible record of this traumatic rupture. The tension between flesh and augmentation defines the physical stakes of this world. The film presents the body as a vulnerable, fragile entity constantly under threat of mechanical replacement. Luke's ultimate transformation into a cyborg is the tragic culmination of his physical and psychological breaking point. By replacing his severed limb with a mechanical prosthetic, the film underscores the loss of his initial, organic integrity. He begins as a boy seeking the heroic identity of his father, only to end the film physically integrated with the very technology that sustains the tyranny he opposes. This synthesis of biology and machine is the physical evidence of his trauma, marking his transition from a seeker to a man who must now navigate the world with a permanent, artificial reminder of his defeat. His primary coping mechanism is one of anxious, driven idealism. Luke continuously attempts to force reality to conform to his internal moral narrative, suppressing the discomfort of his failure until the environment forces a confrontation. This internal drive creates a compulsion to repeat his mistakes, most notably in his premature departure from Dagobah. Despite warnings, he throws himself into a situation where he is objectively underprepared, effectively recreating the conditions for his own destruction to satisfy a need for immediate agency. The film treats this not as a simple character flaw, but as the inevitable result of an ego attempting to assert control over a reality that has already decided his trajectory. The antagonist, Darth Vader, serves as the dark, fully realized projection of this trajectory. Vader exists as a totalized somatic experience of trauma. He is a man almost entirely subsumed by his own history of violence and subsequent technological preservation. His presence on screen is defined by the rhythmic, mechanical nature of his breathing, a sound that serves as a diegetic trigger for the loss of humanity. Where Luke is still attempting to maintain a fragile, human center, Vader has surrendered to the machine, demonstrating the ultimate endpoint of the psychological fracture Luke experiences. The rapport between them is parasitic, with Vader actively drawing upon Luke's internal instability to manipulate his evolution. By the time the final confrontation occurs on Bespin, the characters' physical positions, all dwarfed by vast, industrial architecture, emphasize their smallness in the face of the systems and histories they inhabit. The film culminates in the collapse of Luke's facade, leaving him hanging in the void, literally and figuratively suspended between his past identity and the terrifying, mechanized reality of his future. This ending offers no immediate catharsis, instead forcing the viewer to confront the reality that for the survivor of such trauma, the struggle for coherence is a permanent, ongoing project of the body and mind. The Shadow and the Antagonist. The Empire Strikes Back functions as a profound excavation of the Jungian shadow, utilizing the relationship between Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader to externalize the psychological hazards of the hero's journey. Vader operates as the terrifying, literal manifestation of everything Luke is capable of becoming should his commitment to the Jedi path falter. Through this dynamic, the film posits that the antagonist is not merely an obstacle to be overcome, but a dark reflection of the protagonist's latent impulses toward absolute control, anger, and the abandonment of human connection. The tension between them is fundamentally symbiotic. Vader requires Luke's potential to complete his own vision of a galactic order, while Luke requires the threat of Vader to define the boundaries of his emerging identity. Vader's worldview is grounded in a rigorous, if brutal, epistemological framework. From his perspective, the galaxy is a chaotic entity that demands the imposition of order to prevent collapse. He views himself not as a villain, but as the only figure possessing the clarity and power to enforce a necessary stability. His pragmatism, seen in his systematic hunting of the rebels and his ruthless pruning of his own incompetent officers, is a reflection of an internal logic that values objective results over individual morality. By aligning his actions with the preservation of a singular, coherent regime, Vader justifies his violence as a service to a greater, long-term stability. This logical consistency makes him a more formidable adversary than any purely chaotic force, as he is acting upon an ideology that seeks to replace the fragility of human sentiment with the predictability of imperial iron. Han Solo serves as the crucial mirror character, positioned alongside Luke but charting a divergent path regarding the acceptance of responsibility and community. While Luke is tasked with inheriting a legacy of power and the heavy burden of destiny, Han represents the rejection of such grand narratives in favor of individual autonomy and survival. When confronted with the same systemic pressures, the pursuit by the Empire and the collapsing security of the rebel cause, Han initially chooses withdrawal and the preservation of his own ego. His trajectory acts as a diagnostic tool for Luke's own development. By watching Han navigate the same world through a lens of skepticism, the audience recognizes that the heroic choice is a deliberate, difficult construction rather than a natural state of being. The interpersonal dynamics in the film are inherently parasitic, most notably in the relationship between the Emperor and Vader. The Emperor feeds upon Vader's trauma, utilizing the dark remnants of his past to ensure his total subservience. This power dynamic ripples outward, as Vader attempts to replicate this control over Luke. The invitation to rule the galaxy as father and son is an offer to enter a cycle of consumption, where Luke's youth and potential would be devoured to sustain the aging, necrotic power structure of the Empire. This thematic focus on the consumption of one's emotional and physical capital forces Luke to recognize that the path of the shadow is one of isolation and the eventual depletion of the self. Finally, Luke engages in a consistent, unfair projection of his own insecurities onto those around him, particularly his mentors. He demands that Yoda and Obi-Wan provide him with the certainty of a binary, simple moral code that reality does not support. When they prove unable to shield him from the complexities of his lineage or the brutality of his training, he lashes out, projecting his fear of his own power onto their perceived failures. He views his mentors as symbols of a rigid structure that owes him answers, failing to see that his frustration is actually a fear of the uncontrolled potential he feels rising within his own spirit. The Empire Strikes Back concludes that the integration of the shadow is the primary requirement for the hero. The film acts as an architectural study of a soul realizing that the enemy, the mentor, and the self are all inextricably linked through the common struggle of existing in a reality that offers no guarantees of goodness. The visual proof of the psyche. The Empire Strikes Back functions as a profound exploration of the fragmented psyche, utilizing the vast, indifferent scale of its galaxy to map the interior dissolution of its protagonists. While often regarded as a swashbuckling space adventure, the film is fundamentally a clinical study of how trauma dismantles the ego, forcing characters to confront the reality that their identities are constructed upon foundational falsehoods. The narrative moves beyond a simple struggle of factions, instead centering on the psychological erosion of Luke Skywalker, Han Solo, and Princess Leia as they are stripped of their defensive masks by an encroaching, inescapable shadow. The film employs spatial psychology to mirror this internal collapse, consistently isolating its characters within environments that dwarf their human concerns. The icy wastes of Hoth and the suffocating, metallic interiors of Cloud City serve as externalizations of the character's psychological vulnerability. Luke's training on Dagobah, characterized by dense, claustrophobic foliage and the encroaching, unnatural gloom of the Cave of Evil, acts as a crucible where the architecture of his self-image is physically challenged. The visual effects team achieves this isolation not through mere spectacle, but through the deliberate juxtaposition of the individual against overwhelming, indifferent systems, be it the freezing vacuum of space or the automated, sterile machinery of the Empire. When Luke encounters his own reflection in the Dagobah cave, the image is not merely a symbolic trial, it is a manifestation of the shadow self, proving that the threat to his psyche is sourced entirely from within his own unresolved history. Central to this psychological breakdown is the destruction of the metanarrative that informs the protagonists' lives. Luke enters the film operating under the comfortable, binary construct of the Jedi hero archetype. This facade is shattered during his duel with Darth Vader, an event that serves as the film's epistemic fracture. Vader does not just defeat Luke in physical combat, he destroys the foundational mythos of Luke's existence. By revealing his paternity, Vader forces Luke to reckon with a reality that fundamentally contradicts the heroic ego he has spent years cultivating. This moment functions as a traumatic reset, where the somatic reality of his lost hand and the psychic reality of his heritage converge to leave him unmoored from his previous ethical framework. The antagonist, Darth Vader, serves as the ultimate Jungian manifestation of the character's repressed traits. He is the logical endpoint of a world governed by totalizing, mechanical control. His worldview is one of absolute pragmatism, where the messiness of human emotion is treated as a systemic inefficiency to be purged. In his presence, the other characters are forced to abandon their performative, public behaviors and retreat into raw, exposed states of vulnerability. The dialogue, particularly the exchanges between Vader and his subordinates, reveals the terrifying efficiency of a state that demands the total commodification of the soul. Vader is a man who has surrendered his flesh to the service of a monolithic ideology, and he demands the same transformation from Luke. The film's technical execution reinforces this theme of the soul in crisis. The transition from the chaotic, visceral warmth of the rebel base to the cold, blue-hued, and highly regulated aesthetic of the Imperial-occupied Cloud City creates a visual progression of systemic encroaching upon the human spirit. The lighting in the final act, specifically the chiaroscuro framing of the duel in the carbon-freezing chamber, emphasizes the depth of the character's entrapment. The use of sound, from the heavy, mechanical breathing of the antagonist to the unnatural silence of the void during the film's most pivotal emotional revelations, creates an atmosphere where the character's internal struggles are projected onto the very fabric of their reality. The score and sound design ensure that every moment of profound realization is felt as a physical weight, pressing down on the characters until their defensive facades are completely dismantled. Ultimately, The Empire Strikes Back concludes not with a return to stability, but with an open-ended confrontation with truth. The final image of the protagonists, staring out into the vast, uncaring expanse of the galaxy from the deck of a medical frigate, signifies the total loss of their previous certainty. The ego that defined them at the start of the journey has been destroyed, and the film leaves them in a state of unresolved, existential transition. By prioritizing the internal damage over the external victory, the film asserts that true growth is contingent upon the total destruction of the lies we tell ourselves to maintain order. The struggle against the systemic shadow is merely the backdrop. The true battlefield is the individual's willingness to stare into the abyss of their own history and accept the reality of the fragmented self. Part 4. Philosophical Underpinnings. Epistemology and Discourse. The Empire Strikes Back functions as a profound examination of epistemic crisis, where the protagonist's growth is measured not by his ability to conquer, but by his capacity to reconcile contradictory truths. The film operates on the principle that knowledge is a process of unlearning, positioning the acquisition of wisdom as a violent dismantling of the self's inherited narrative. Luke Skywalker begins the film within a stable, if simplified, moral framework, a binary understanding of heroism that relies on the clear delineation between the Rebel Alliance and the Galactic Empire. However, the film systematically strips away the safety of this discourse, forcing Luke to navigate a reality where his fundamental understanding of his own lineage and the nature of the Force is exposed as a construct. The epistemic authority in the galaxy is contested between the didactic, rule-bound teachings of Yoda and the deceptive, revisionist history offered by Darth Vader. While the Jedi path emphasizes a sensory and intuitive connection to the universe, it remains a system built upon a specific, rigid vocabulary. Yoda acts as a gatekeeper of this ancient discourse, demanding that Luke abandon his physical perceptions in favor of a metaphysical reality that defies logical categorization. Yet, this is not merely a pedagogical exercise, it is an attempt to define the limits of Luke's world through the limits of his language. Yoda's speech patterns and cryptic abstractions serve to break the listener's reliance on linear, literal interpretation, forcing a transition into a more holistic, albeit terrifying, mode of perception. Conversely, Darth Vader represents a dark, performative epistemology. His revelation to Luke is a rupture in the film's reality, destroying the objective, externalized morality that sustained the rebellion. By claiming the role of father, Vader forces a collapse of the metanarrative that defined Luke's existence. This is not just a tactical lie or a psychological ploy, it is a fundamental reconfiguration of the past. The film posits that truth is not a static object waiting to be discovered, but a malleable narrative controlled by those with the power to define the terms of the conflict. When the discourse of the heroic son is replaced by the reality of the descendant of the villain, the audience witnesses the terrifying realization that identity is tethered to a history that can be weaponized. This thematic focus on the fracture of certainty informs the film's visual and spatial language. Luke's journey to the cave on Dagobah serves as the ultimate test of Cartesian doubt. Within the cave, he encounters his own likeness behind the mask of his enemy, a visceral manifestation of the idea that reality is mediated by the observer's own internal projections. He cannot trust his eyes because he cannot trust his own subconscious, which paints the external world in the colors of his fears. The film argues that true agency only emerges when the character accepts that the official version of reality, whether provided by the moral certainty of the Jedi or the oppressive propaganda of the Empire, is an insufficient map of the human condition. The struggle for truth in The Empire Strikes Back is a rejection of the comfort found in absolute, mediated narratives. The film denies its characters, and by extension, the audience, the stability of a singular, authorized perspective. Instead, it offers a vision of truth that is fragmented, deeply personal, and inextricably linked to the acceptance of pain. The final act, set against the backdrop of the vast, indifferent void of space, leaves the characters physically and emotionally untethered. This is the film's most significant philosophical assertion: the abandonment of a coherent, prepackaged worldview is not a failure, but a prerequisite for authentic existence. By destroying the illusions that kept Luke centered, the film moves the narrative from a simple tale of cosmic conflict to a mature inquiry into the difficulty of remaining an individual in a universe where the most potent forces, both light and dark, seek to define who you are before you have the chance to decide for yourself. The lack of a neat resolution is the film's greatest intellectual triumph, as it preserves the necessity of the struggle, affirming that the pursuit of truth is an endless, solitary endeavor that begins only when the old world and its vocabulary have been left behind. Metanarratives and social theory. The Empire Strikes Back serves as a profound meditation on the failure of inherited grand narratives, positioning the collapse of romanticized heroism as the necessary prerequisite for individual maturity. While the surface-level reading presents the film as a mythic struggle between light and dark, a deeper investigation reveals a structural critique of the epistemic certainty that defined the rebellion's initial, naive optimism. The film functions as an intensive deconstruction of the hero's journey, forcing its protagonists into a reality where the binary moral frameworks provided by their respective ideologies, the Jedi Order for Luke Skywalker and the foundational hope of the Rebel Alliance, prove fundamentally insufficient to confront the complexities of institutional power. The governing reality of the film is defined by an encroaching systemic consolidation. The Galactic Empire operates not merely as a military occupying force but as a pervasive ideological state apparatus. Its control is maintained through the precise, cold calculation of technological superiority and the strategic manipulation of space. Where the rebellion clings to the fading, almost hallowed remnants of ancient wisdom, the Empire represents the triumph of hyperbureaucratic, totalizing architecture. This shift is most visible in the contrast between the organic, messy resilience of the rebels, seen in the damp, claustrophobic caves of Hoth, and the sterile, frictionless, and vertical hierarchies of the Imperial fleet. The Empire has commodified the very fabric of the galaxy, reducing planetary bodies to resources and rebels to tactical errors to be calculated and erased. Luke Skywalker's trajectory embodies the violent disintegration of a sheltered worldview. His training on Dagobah serves as an epistemological crisis. Yoda dismantles Luke's reliance on physical prowess and external validation, forcing him to engage with the abstract, often uncomfortable nature of the Force. The cave sequence on Dagobah acts as the crucible for this shift, where Luke's failure to differentiate between the internal shadow and external reality proves that his understanding of the world is purely projective. His traumatic encounter with Darth Vader on Bespin functions as the total collapse of his metanarrative. The realization that his enemy is the literal embodiment of his own lineage destroys the simple, dualistic framework he was taught to uphold. Vader is not an aberration to be defeated by traditional morality, he is the inevitable destination of the path Luke is currently traversing. The film's ethical weight is found in the divergence between the characters' desires and their stark, material reality. Han Solo and Leia Organa inhabit a world where their survival is predicated on navigating a web of pragmatic alliances and unreliable infrastructure. Their reliance on Lando Calrissian, a character forced into a precarious position of compromise, illustrates the impossibility of maintaining pure moral integrity within a system designed to extract loyalty through extortion. The film refuses to offer the comfort of a clean victory, instead emphasizing the necessity of the absurd revolt. By the final frame, the protagonists are physically broken, socially displaced, and stripped of their foundational myths. This is not a failure of their cause, but a maturation of their agency. They move from acting within a preordained narrative to confronting an unpredictable, chaotic future. The technical execution reinforces this atmosphere of existential erosion. The cinematography uses depth and negative space to render the characters as fragile points of light against the overwhelming, encroaching darkness of the Imperial machine. The use of shadow, particularly in the lighting of the Cloud City sequences, emphasizes the ambiguity of the characters' moral positioning. The iconic score and the rhythmic, precise editing serve as a counterpoint to the characters' internal instability, suggesting that while the universe is indifferent and deterministic, the act of defiance remains a deeply human, if ultimately solitary, choice. The Empire Strikes Back leaves the audience in a state of suspended uncertainty, correctly asserting that the most significant growth occurs when the structures of the past are dismantled, leaving only the raw, often painful responsibility of defining oneself against a void. Ethics and the moral calculus. The Empire Strikes Back functions as a rigorous inquiry into the ethics of commitment, moving beyond simple heroism to examine the crushing weight of the moral calculus. The film's philosophical foundation rests on the necessity of action within a universe defined by both systemic oppression and the ambiguity of the Force. Luke Skywalker's progression is not merely a hero's journey, but a confrontation with the limits of deontological ethics, the adherence to duty and universal rules, when pitted against the seductive, pragmatic utilitarianism of the Galactic Empire. The central ethical dilemma is anchored in Luke's decision to abandon his training at Dagobah to rescue his friends. From a strict Jedi perspective, this is a failure of discipline. It is an emotional, reactive choice that risks the greater good for the sake of the few. Yet, the film argues that this failure is the defining moment of Luke's moral agency. By rejecting the detached, monastic preservation of the Jedi Order to preserve the lives of Han and Leia, Luke asserts that moral personhood is inseparable from human connection. The film posits that ethics cannot exist in a vacuum of intellectual purity. Instead, it mandates that one must be willing to suffer the consequences of an imperfect choice to remain authentically human. This struggle highlights the distinction between the protagonist's moral architecture and that of Darth Vader. Vader represents the cold, apex realization of the ends justifies the means. His vision of a galaxy stabilized by the iron fist of the Empire is logically consistent. He seeks to end the chaos of civil war through total control. His violence is methodical, restorative in its own dark logic, and entirely detached from individual suffering. When Vader invites Luke to join him, he is offering a transition into a system where the greater good is a mathematical certainty. The ideological gap between them is not found in the desire for order, but in the source of their violence. Luke's actions are defined by the burden of sacrifice, his willingness to lose his hand and his innocence, while Vader's actions are defined by the sacrifice of others. The film further explores the ethics of ignorance versus the burden of truth, particularly through the revelation of Luke's parentage. The Jedi mentors, Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda, operate on a philosophy of controlled information, viewing the truth as a volatile substance that must be managed to ensure the student's trajectory toward a specific, predetermined outcome. They believe in the ethics of the noble lie. However, the film sides with the painful, disruptive reality. When the facade of the heroic father is shattered by the brutal truth of the villain, Luke's psychological equilibrium is destroyed, yet he is granted a more profound, albeit terrifying, autonomy. He is forced to construct his own meaning in the wake of this revelation, choosing to reject Vader's path while accepting the reality of his lineage. This alignment with existential struggle serves as the film's version of the absurd revolt. Confronted with a reality that dictates he is the product of his enemy, Luke does not descend into nihilism. He denies the deterministic trap laid by the Empire and the manipulative, restrictive guidance of his masters. He constructs his own moral framework in real time, one that prioritizes the preservation of the individual's conscience over the dictates of power or the safety of the status quo. The film culminates in the realization that the moral life is fundamentally about the management of one's own shadows. By refusing to join Vader, Luke refuses to accept the logic of a closed system where power is the only currency. He recognizes that personhood is earned through the rejection of the easy, institutional path. The Empire Strikes Back suggests that the most ethical position is found in the willingness to remain incomplete, wounded, and vulnerable, rather than choosing the polished, synthetic perfection of a controlled reality. The film leaves the viewer with the understanding that the struggle itself, the decision to act with integrity when the outcome is guaranteed to be painful, is the primary measure of a person's worth. Through this lens, the moral architecture of the galaxy is rewritten. It is not the victory of the system that matters, but the endurance of the individual soul in its refusal to be commodified by the machinery of total power. Determinism, agency, and time. The Empire Strikes Back functions as a profound meditation on the terrifying reality of human agency within a deterministic universe. While the surface narrative centers on the binary struggle between the Rebel Alliance and the Galactic Empire, the film operates primarily as an investigation into how characters navigate the boundaries of their own preordained paths. Luke Skywalker's journey is defined by a constant, agonizing negotiation between the destiny thrust upon him by his lineage and the choices he must make to assert his individual identity. This tension suggests that the universe operates on a structuralist logic where certain roles, the Jedi, the Sith, the air, are fixed, yet the film posits that true moral character is forged only through the active, often painful, rejection of those rigid scripts. The film meticulously dismantles the illusion of comfort inherent in prophecy and heritage. When Luke seeks training from Yoda, he expects the tools of a hero, yet he encounters a master who prioritizes the discipline of the mind over the accumulation of power. The Dagobah cave sequence serves as the crucible for this realization, forcing Luke to confront a version of himself that is already a product of the dark side. This vision represents the deterministic trap, the fear that Luke is already, by nature, the man he dreads becoming. The cave does not present a future that will happen, but a state of being that is inherent to his human nature. The film argues that agency is not found in avoiding these shadows, but in the conscious, voluntary movement toward a different configuration of self. This philosophy extends to the antagonist as well. Darth Vader is not merely an agent of evil, he is the manifestation of total submission to the system. He exists as a man who has fully traded his individual agency for the mechanical authority of the Empire. His pursuit of Luke is a demand that the younger Skywalker accept a deterministic inheritance, join the Father, rule the galaxy, and accept the logic of the system as an immutable law. In the climactic confrontation on Bespin, Vader's reveal serves as an ontological break. By anchoring Luke to a history he did not choose, Vader attempts to collapse the protagonist's future into the past. The moment Luke rejects this offer, choosing to fall into the abyss rather than accept a pre-written identity, he performs the ultimate act of existential defiance. He chooses physical annihilation over the surrender of his autonomy. The film's visual language reinforces this conflict between the crushing scale of institutional structures and the isolated individual. The cinematography of Cloud City, with its sterile, vast, and geometric interiors, presents a world where individual movement is directed by the architecture itself. Characters are frequently framed against massive, indifferent technological backdrops, emphasizing the fragility of the human form in a galaxy governed by cold, systematic efficiency. Yet, the framing of the human face, the close-up, always reclaims the narrative from the scale of the environment. The film insists that even when the system seems absolute, the internal psychological state of the individual remains the only site of true, unpredictable potential. Ultimately, The Empire Strikes Back finds its resonance in the idea that the struggle for meaning is its own justification. By the time the survivors gather on the medical frigate to look out toward the expanse of the galaxy, the situation has worsened by every measurable metric. The heroes have lost, the rebellion is scattered, and the psychological wounds are profound. Yet, the film concludes that this failure is not a terminal point but a necessary shedding of illusions. The characters are no longer operating under the naive belief that the universe will favor their morality. They are now agents who have looked into the void of their own predetermined endings and chosen to continue the fight regardless. This is not a story of victory through tactical success, but a rigorous, often bleak, endorsement of the human will. It posits that while history and bloodlines may provide the terrain upon which one must walk, the decision to cross that terrain, despite the certainty of suffering, is the only thing that distinguishes the living from the machine. The film leaves the audience with the understanding that existential hope is not the expectation of a positive outcome, but the persistent, deliberate continuation of the struggle against an indifferent architecture of power. Part 5: The Craft and Illusion. Cinematography and Spatial Language. The Empire Strikes Back establishes its authority through a rigorous visual language where spatial orientation serves as the primary metric for character development and ideological tension. Irvin Kershner and cinematographer Peter Saskitsky utilize the film's physical environment to dictate power dynamics, grounding the abstract conflicts of the Force and the rebellion in tangible, architectural realities. The camera functions as an omniscient observer, adopting a measured, deliberate movement that reinforces the sense of an unfolding, inexorable fate. By employing smooth, fluid tracking shots that prioritize clarity and geographic continuity, the cinematography grants the viewer a heightened awareness of the protagonist's vulnerability within vast, indifferent settings. The film's visual hierarchy is built upon a foundation of verticality and scale. On the frozen plains of Hoth, the low-angle framing of the AT-AT walkers establishes them as monumental, dehumanized engines of state power, while the human rebels are captured in wide, often claustrophobic compositions that emphasize their insignificance against the encroaching mechanical tide. As the narrative shifts to the ethereal, dreamlike architecture of Cloud City, the framing evolves into a precise geometry of isolation. The vast, orange-hued voids of the city's interiors force characters like Luke Skywalker and Lando Calrissian into specific quadrants of the frame, turning the setting itself into an instrument of psychological entrapment. The use of deep focus ensures that the negative space, the crushing silence of the abyss, remains a constant, palpable threat, reminding the audience that these characters are suspended above an emptiness that reflects their own internal uncertainty. Color serves as a critical signifier of internal transformation and thematic shifting throughout the narrative. The monochromatic, harsh whites and grays of Hoth communicate a stripping away of comfort, forcing the characters into a state of primal survival. This palette provides a stark departure from the warm, saturated environments of later sequences, mirroring the characters' transition from the rigid binary of the rebellion into the murky, complex moral landscape of Dagobah. On Dagobah, the color palette shifts to a muddy, organic subterranean gloom. The diffusion of light in the swamp scene softens the edges of the frame, creating an environment that feels tactile, ancient, and resistant to the sterile technological order represented by the Empire. By contrasting the cold, artificial blues and grays of Imperial command decks with the earthy greens and ochres of the swamp, the film visually maps the fundamental divergence between a life governed by deterministic machines and one rooted in the chaotic, intuitive nature of the Force. Light acts as a tool for both revelation and concealment, particularly in the film's most pivotal moments of confrontation. The lighting in the carbon freezing chamber is a masterpiece of high-contrast chiaroscuro, utilizing deep shadows to obscure the true nature of the antagonists while bathing the protagonist in a spotlight that exposes his physical and existential frailty. This chiaroscuro does more than define space, it creates a manifestation of the Jungian shadow, as Vader emerges from the darkness to dismantle Luke's identity. The light does not provide clarity or hope, instead, it carves out a stage for the revelation of trauma. When Vader speaks the truth of Luke's lineage, the lighting remains harsh and unforgiving, stripping away the protagonist's manufactured self-conception and leaving him exposed within the frame. The camera's movement throughout these sequences remains disciplined and objective, avoiding erratic, hand-held sensations in favor of steady, gliding motions that suggest the cold calculations of a grand design. Even in the film's most intense combat, the cinematography maintains a focus on the weight and momentum of the participants. The choice of lens compression in the final duel on the gantry forces the figures together, making their proximity feel inescapable and claustrophobic. By refusing to break the spatial logic of the scene, the film ensures that the viewer experiences the collapse of the protagonist's world as a physical reality. The mastery of these technical elements creates a cinematic environment where every frame confirms the argument that the characters are not merely fighting a war against a political entity, but are engaged in an existential struggle against a system that seeks to define their nature through the architecture of control. The precision of the craft, the deliberate placement of light, the strategic use of negative space, and the calculated movement of the camera collapses the distance between the audience and the screen, transforming the film into a tactile exploration of identity, trauma, and the crushing weight of inevitable truth. VFX, CGI, and the technical uncanny. The Empire Strikes Back achieves a landmark synthesis of craft and illusion, functioning as a masterclass in physical presence through the meticulous layering of practical effects, matte paintings, and complex optical compositing. The film's visual authority stems from its absolute commitment to weight and texture, grounding its fantastic elements in a tactile reality that feels weathered, lived in, and dangerously vulnerable. By rejecting the sterile smoothness often associated with later technological advancements, the film forces the viewer to engage with a world that possesses a genuine, physical friction. The integration of these effects relies on a rigorous adherence to the laws of light and motion established by the production's practical photography. When X-Wings navigate the dense, ice-choked asteroid field, the visual success of the sequence is predicated on the consistency of shadow and bounce light between the miniature models and the composite backgrounds. Because the team employed sophisticated motion control cameras, the movement of these ships exhibits a rhythmic, Newtonian logic that avoids the weightless, floating quality often found in less disciplined digital environments. Each collision carries the kinetic consequence of mass, and every explosion radiates with the volatile, unpredictable energy of practical pyrotechnics. This gravity is the film's most potent illusion. It convinces the audience that these objects inhabit space, not merely a screen. The film excels in the use of invisible effects, the quiet, transformative work that defines its architectural geography. On Bespin, the sprawling, ornate cityscapes are presented through breathtaking matte paintings that seamlessly blend with live-action sets. These expansive vistas are not merely backdrops, they serve to emphasize the protagonist's psychological isolation. By anchoring the actors within these meticulously crafted, deep perspective environments, the visual design underscores the fragility of the human element against the cold, industrial vastness of the Empire. The lighting on these sets is consistently directional and harsh, mirroring the moral clarity and existential pressure bearing down on the characters. This aesthetic creates a cohesive atmosphere where the distinction between the physical stage and the painted horizon vanishes, allowing the viewer to fully inhabit the space. Furthermore, the character-driven VFX, most notably the puppet work and animatronics, operate with a distinct, organic vitality that sidesteps the uncanny valley entirely. Yoda is not a digital construct, but a physical performance captured through the nuanced manipulation of foam and latex. Because the puppet occupies the same space as the human actors, reflecting the same environment and interacting with the same light, it demands the same emotional engagement as any flesh and blood co-star. The micro-movements of his features, the texture of his skin, and the deliberate blinking patterns are all artifacts of physical craftsmanship that convey a depth of soul impossible to replicate through purely algorithmic means. The film's sonic environment further bolsters this technical success. The integration of non-diegetic music with diegetic sound effects, the low-frequency hum of a lightsaber, the heavy mechanical respiration of Darth Vader, or the ambient, industrial groans of the Millennium Falcon, creates a sensory loop that feels entirely self-contained. The silence in the void of space is utilized as a weapon, heightening the tension during critical moments of psychological revelation. By prioritizing tactile authenticity over technical showiness, The Empire Strikes Back establishes a cinematic language where the craft itself disappears, leaving behind a visceral experience of conflict and discovery. The technical execution is never a distraction, it is the fundamental infrastructure upon which the film's emotional and philosophical weight resides, proving that the most profound illusions are those that respect the immutable laws of light, weight, and human emotion. Audio, rhythm, and sensory manipulation. The sonic architecture of The Empire Strikes Back functions as a primary engine for psychological immersion, establishing a reality defined by the tension between mechanical oppression and the haunting, ethereal nature of the Force. The sound design creates a sensory environment where the distinction between diegetic machinery and non-diegetic musical score frequently collapses, binding the viewer to the protagonist's erratic mental state. During the harrowing sequence within the belly of the space slug, the film utilizes low-frequency, subterranean vibrations that blend seamlessly with John Williams' ominous, atonal orchestral swells. This melding of sound effects and composition blurs the boundary of the audience's perception, suggesting that the environment itself is a living, predatory participant in the narrative. The film meticulously modulates its sonic density to mirror Luke Skywalker's progression from youthful, reactive instability to the crushing weight of existential revelation. In the sprawling, high-stakes chaos of the Battle of Hoth, the soundscape is overwhelming, defined by the sharp, repetitive staccato of laser fire and the deafening, metallic thrum of AT-AT walkers. These mechanical rhythms serve as an audio-based representation of the Imperial state, a relentless, synchronized power that drowns out individual agency. As the narrative shifts toward the isolation of Dagobah, the sonic environment contracts sharply. The density of the war zone is replaced by the unsettling, rhythmic calls of alien fauna and the damp, organic squelch of the swamp. This transition signifies a movement from external conflict to internal confrontation. The absence of the mechanical drone forces the protagonist into a state of heightened self-awareness, where every rustle in the foliage feels like a psychological projection of his own anxieties. The film employs silence as a sophisticated instrument of dread, most notably during the climactic duel in the Cloud City carbon freezing chamber. As the gravity of the encounter intensifies, the mix progressively strips away ambient noise, leaving the hum of the lightsaber as the primary tether to reality. By narrowing the audio perspective to the immediate, intimate space between Luke and Darth Vader, the film denies the viewer the comfort of a broader context. The reduction of sound acts as a sensory bottleneck, forcing the audience to focus exclusively on the power dynamics within the frame. When the final revelation occurs, a moment that shatters Luke's epistemological foundation, the score surges with a discordant, operatic force that effectively drowns out the character's immediate reaction. This editorial choice prioritizes the mythic weight of the information over the character's internal vocalization, reinforcing the idea that the truth has rendered his individual identity obsolete. Editing and rhythm are inextricably linked to the film's pacing, which accelerates and decelerates in direct alignment with Luke's proximity to his shadow. In the training sequences under Yoda, the cutting is patient and deliberate, characterized by long, fluid shots that emphasize the labor of patience and the mastery of focus. Conversely, the film's cross-cutting between the disparate threads of the rebellion creates an auditory and visual feedback loop of frantic urgency. The rapid shifts between the claustrophobic interiors of the Millennium Falcon and the cold, vast vistas of space mirror the character's attempts to escape a system that is mathematically closing in on them. The audio mix remains sensitive to character geography, consistently placing the audience within the internal logic of the scene. When the characters enter the sterile, frictionless corridors of Cloud City, the sound design adopts a sharp, reverberant quality that underscores the deceptive cleanliness of Lando Calrissian's domain. This sonic clarity creates a sense of profound vulnerability, as the characters are stripped of the noisy protection of their ships and forced into an environment where every footfall is audible and scrutinized. Ultimately, the film's technical mastery lies in its ability to manipulate the viewer's sensory experience, using sound not merely to complement the visuals, but to enforce the philosophical necessity of the protagonist's isolation. By controlling the frequency, rhythm, and silence within the frame, the film ensures that the viewer's experience of the story is as fragmented, overwhelming, and ultimately transformative as the journey of the hero himself. Synthesis of craft. The Empire Strikes Back achieves its narrative weight by subordinating technical spectacle to the internal fragmentation of its characters. The film employs a sophisticated visual language where the architecture of the frame functions as a barometer for the protagonist's deteriorating certainty. By favoring specific lens geometries and lighting textures, the production creates an environment that feels tactile, lived in, and physically obstructive, forcing characters to navigate a world that is as much a manifestation of their psychological stakes as it is a setting for their conflict. The cinematography utilizes long lenses to compress space, particularly during moments of intimacy or profound realization. This choice creates a visual claustrophobia that isolates Luke Skywalker within the frame, emphasizing his entrapment between the divergent ideologies of his mentors. When Luke enters the cave on Dagobah, the long lens compression collapses the distance between him and his own projected darkness. The resulting image, Luke facing a manifestation of Vader that possesses his own face, functions as a technical metaphor for the film's central thesis. The craftsmanship here is not merely about spectacle, it is about the erasure of the distance between the self and the shadow. The camera effectively traps the protagonist within a frame that offers no room for denial or external flight. The use of chiaroscuro lighting further reinforces this Jungian dynamic. Throughout the film, Vader is frequently rendered in silhouette or sharp, high-contrast lighting that hides his humanity while emphasizing his mechanical inevitability. Conversely, Luke is often bathed in soft, diffused light that underscores his vulnerability and unfinished development. As the film progresses toward the duel in Cloud City, these two lighting strategies bleed into one another. When Luke loses his hand, a literal amputation of his previous identity, he is thrust into the same deep, cavernous shadows that define the antagonist. The light becomes a bridge, visually confirming that the boundary between the hero and the villain is a construction of perception rather than an inherent moral divide. The technical execution of the practical effects and matte painting serves to maintain the illusion of a decaying, expansive galaxy. The production design avoids the pristine sterility of modern digital environments in favor of a gritty, industrial aesthetic where hardware is consistently failing or showing signs of wear. This physical texture is vital to the film's philosophy. By emphasizing the decay of machinery, the visual presentation highlights the limitations of the material world. When characters interact with consoles, ships, or the environments of Hoth and Bespin, the interaction is grounded in weight and resistance. This commitment to the physicality of the medium, the grain of the film stock, the tangible dust of the sets, and the deliberate pacing of practical transitions, creates a sense of inevitability that mirrors the protagonist's loss of agency. Furthermore, the choreography of the frame within the final act signifies a shift from active engagement to passive endurance. The camera movement becomes increasingly fluid and detached as the narrative reaches its climax, transforming the viewer from an participant in the adventure into an observer of a tragedy. In the climactic reveal, the camera does not pull away to offer an expansive view, it closes in, focusing on the intimate, devastating reaction of the hero. This decision elevates the technical feat of the reveal, making it the most philosophically significant moment in the series. The technical craft works in service of a profound epistemic collapse, where the character's reality is destroyed not by an external explosion, but by the shattering of a personal narrative. The synthesis of these elements ensures that the film's technical advancements remain invisible in their intent. The matte paintings of the Bespin skyline do not merely display scale, they create a lonely, suspended existence that traps the characters in a state of purgatory. The sound design, marked by the mechanical, rhythmic respiration of the antagonist and the whistling of the wind across frozen plains, dictates the emotional rhythm of the scenes, reinforcing the isolation of the individuals within a vast, indifferent system. By integrating these technical choices into the narrative, The Empire Strikes Back establishes that the most effective illusions are those that feel perfectly grounded in the harsh, material realities of the characters' lives. The visual and auditory world of the film is not a backdrop for the journey, but an active participant in the systematic dismantling of the hero's ego. Part 6. Synthesis and Legacy. Synthesis and Legacy. The Empire Strikes Back functions as a fundamental deconstruction of the hero's journey, replacing the triumphant exteriority of classic myth with a rigorous examination of internal collapse and systemic entrapment. While it is often viewed as the middle movement of a grand space opera, the film is actually an intimate study of how individuals are processed, diminished, and ultimately redefined by powers that operate on a scale beyond human comprehension. The film posits that true growth is not found in the acquisition of mastery, but in the catastrophic loss of the fabricated ego. By dismantling the protagonist's perception of his own lineage and moral infallibility, the narrative reveals that human identity is perpetually subordinate to the competing forces of deterministic legacy and existential contingency. The world of this film is defined by cold, industrial scarcity and the crushing weight of architecture. Whether within the claustrophobic, snow-swept corridors of Echo Base or the vast, sterile opulence of Cloud City, the environment acts as a mechanism of confinement. The ruling power, the Empire, is a manifestation of absolute order that renders the individual a negligible variable. This world exists in a state of perpetual flight. The protagonists occupy the liminal spaces between empires, scavenging for survival in the rusted-out remnants of forgotten conflicts. There is a profound tension between the organic human element and the synthetic, machine-driven infrastructure of the galaxy. Technology here is not a tool of liberation but a cold enforcer of hierarchy, and the film uses its visual scale, dwarfing characters against massive star destroyers and endless, bottomless industrial shafts, to emphasize their inherent vulnerability. At the heart of this struggle is the epistemic fracture of Luke Skywalker. His journey is marked by a transition from the simplistic binary morality of his upbringing to the chaotic, shadowed reality of his true heritage. The narrative forces a confrontation with the Jungian shadow. Darth Vader is not merely an antagonist, but the physical manifestation of all that Luke risks becoming should he succumb to his own unchecked aggression and fear. The film's psychological depth is grounded in the somatic reality of trauma, most notably in Luke's physical mutilation and the subsequent integration of synthetic augmentation. This transition from flesh to machine serves as the ultimate visual metaphor for his loss of innocence, marking the exact moment his self-conception is permanently altered. The philosophical underpinnings of the film lean into a rejection of the comfort provided by clean, teleological narratives. The Force, initially presented as a tool for noble action, is revealed to be an indifferent, pervasive energy that demands a total sacrifice of self-interest. Yoda, acting as the arbiter of this difficult truth, demands that Luke abandon the very attachments, his friends, his desire for vengeance, his pride, that define his humanity. This creates a powerful ethical dilemma. The pursuit of higher wisdom requires a detachment that feels indistinguishable from cruelty. The film suggests that the path to true understanding is not the accumulation of power, but the acceptance of one's own limitations in the face of an absurd and overwhelming universe. Technically, the film achieves its vision through an unparalleled mastery of scale and practical artifice. The cinematography prioritizes a sense of claustrophobia even within massive environments, utilizing deep shadow and high-contrast lighting to mirror the moral ambiguity of the plot. The sound design is a primary architect of the film's atmosphere, with the pervasive, guttural hum of the Empire's technology serving as a constant reminder of the encroaching order. The visual effects, particularly the intricate model work and matte painting, sell the reality of this decaying, high-stakes world with a weight and texture that anchors the metaphysical conflict in a grounded, physical space. This technical rigor ensures that the audience experiences the protagonist's isolation as a visceral, tactile sensation. The film ends not with a resolution, but with a suspension of status quo that demands an evolution of the spirit. The final image of the fleet, adrift in the vast emptiness, mirrors the uncertainty of the journey's inception, yet the characters themselves have been fundamentally rewritten. The unresolved nature of the conflict serves as a testament to the idea that the struggle for meaning is a recursive process rather than a destination. By choosing to end on a note of incomplete reconciliation, the film asserts that catharsis is an illusion. Real progress comes only from enduring the collapse of one's worldview and choosing to persist in the void. The Empire Strikes Back remains a definitive examination of how one finds agency when the structures of reality, memory, and morality have been stripped away, leaving only the cold necessity of self-definition.